Welcome, Your Holiness. I hope everybody else's attention is not too much distracted by having eaten, but I'm sure that Alan's presentation will be very lively and engaging so that everybody sort of overcomes that impediment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Of course, it is a great honor, also a great pleasure to be here, to try to share some knowledge that may be relevant both to Buddhism and to the rest of the modern world. I want to give a bit of preface, though, because I'm in a very anomalous situation, and that is I'm going to be talking about Buddhist meditation to a group, including audience of geshes, of lamas who have enormous background, insight, experience, and they definitely don't need any basic primer on Buddhist meditation from me, let alone His Holiness. And so the scientists have been asked to always address His Holiness as the primary audience, really the central audience. I'm going to be doing something a bit different. That is, at times I'm going to be directing more out to the scientific community, the general community, when I'm talking about basic Buddhist concepts and definitions, which His Holiness does not need to hear from me. At other times, especially when I'm suggesting interpretations or possible hypotheses of how to understand different states of meditation and so forth, then I'll turn to His Holiness, and especially to all the Buddhists here, ready to be refuted if I make some interpretation that really is quite incorrect. And also I will do this, and that is a lot of what I'll be sharing will be, of course, and everything will be in English, but a fair amount will be translated in my mind directly from Tibetan into English. So occasionally I'm going to just give a phrase, as I did in Saranat. I'll just give a phrase here and there so that there's no question about what I'm translating from the Tibetan. So I'll say something like metta attention, da shijin. And so then hopefully the translation back into Tibetan will be very smooth, and nobody will be wondering what was he meaning then when he said that in terms of Tibetan. Okay, so that'll be the anomaly here. So,
maybe Your Holiness, would you mind to put on the microphone, because then also everybody can hear.
I have nothing to say.
No, just in case questions.
Maybe later.
Questions or additions.
Only uncomfortable.
Ah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, in terms of the title of my presentation here, one could say this is really quite an extraordinary claim for a title, as if in 12 slides, that's all I have. I'm going to be summarizing Buddhist contribution to first-person cognitive science, and of course that is not the case. It's a very vast topic, and I'm going to be focusing on a fairly narrow range, focusing especially on the practice of shamatha, but one area where I think Buddhist tradition may contribute something very significant to the scientific tradition, and in turn benefit from the scientific tradition. In terms of the overall framework, or subject, for my presentation, I want to first paint a very large picture of the framework of Buddhist practice, which is familiar to all Buddhists here, the actual nature of shamatha, shamatha being a Sanskrit term, which is really referring to an array of methods for refining attention skills. Right? The challenges for introspection, that is, if we are going to include introspection as a means of inquiry, seeking to understand the nature of the mind, the potentials of the mind, very deep issues about the nature of consciousness itself, are there challenges built in, or is this going to be very easy to integrate into science? The fact that introspection is not used extensively or rigorously in modern mind sciences indicates there may be some problems here, in which they must be addressed. On the other hand,
introspection
and then the indispensability of introspection, the metamirunga. We must, that is, for a full understanding, if such is possible, or even to approach a full understanding of the mind, one must, I believe, include first-person perspective. It is indispensable. You can't skip it and just study the brain and study behavior and never rely on anybody's first-person account of their own experience. Then the question is, can the introspective observations be more rigorous? Can the reports be more sophisticated? And this is where Buddhism, I think, has much to contribute. Final point that David has already made, so I will make it very briefly, but the complementarity of Buddhist and scientific methods of inquiry. The great strengths of science tend to be not the strengths of Buddhism. The strengths of Buddhism, likewise, overall, not the strengths of modern science. And then I'll end with quite a number of open questions, some of which may be interesting for our following discussion. So this framework of Buddhist practice is true, I believe, pretty much of all schools of Buddhism. that the foundation is really ethics. It is leading a wholesome way of life. It is seeking to do our best to avoid injury. So now I'll address the general audience. By means of our activity of body, speech, and mind, to our utmost to follow the principles of ahimsa, of not deliberately injuring, on the one hand, so that's the negative side, try to avoid that. On the other hand, when possible, when the opportunity arises, seek to be of service. Try to help, as David so well said, alleviate suffering, bring greater happiness. And this is often likened to the earth, and that is at the foundation for, I would really say, all spiritual practice. But with total confidence, I would say it is the foundation of all Buddhist practice. Without this, you really don't have Buddhist practice. Mm-hmm. On that basis, then we have the second tier, or broad training within the Buddhist path, and that is samadhi. Now, this has become an English term now, and samadhi generally is understood as some very focused attention, or maybe some higher meditative state. Its narrow term is single-pointed attention, very focused attention. But when we're speaking of the training of samadhi, not simply the practice or the mental faculty of samadhi, but the training of samadhi, then it's including much more than simply developing attention skills. It would include, for example, the cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. It entails many practices designed to really bring forth a very wholesome quality of mind and to achieve exceptional states of mental balance. So not just attention skills. So that's the broader framework. I would say, in short, that the practice of samadhi is designed to bring about an exceptional state of mental health, well-being, and balance. And that is considered to be a foundation.
Balance.
And so, since the principal instrument of inquiry in the Buddhist tradition is not externalized, it's not a telescope, it's not an fMRI, your principal instrument of inquiry is your own mind. If your mind is dysfunctional, or dysfunctional because it's just flip-flopping between dullness and excitation, and then you try to engage in some rigorous inquiry with a mind that is getting dull and distracted, then the inquiry is not going to be very rigorous. And so in Buddhist inquiry, the primary instrument to be refined, as kind of one could say contemplative technology, is your own mind. And that really is the task or the purpose of training in samadhi. The culmination of the Buddhist path is the realization or the experience of wisdom, insight, and unlike many religious traditions, in Buddhism, the root of suffering, the fundamental root of suffering, why do we suffer, is identified as ignorance and delusion, and not that we've been disobedient to God, that we don't have enough faith, that we've not submitted sufficiently, and so forth. So it's not theistically based of trying to please somebody else, but in fact we suffer because we're ignorant, and therefore if you want to be free of suffering, you must supplant or replace ignorance with knowledge, insight. And it's not just coming up with the right answers, believing, having all the right beliefs. Because you can have all the right beliefs and still suffer enormously. So belief is not the same as knowledge. So this is the largest gestalt or overall form of Buddhist practice, and everything I'll have to say will fit into this. But there, you can see the arrows. Wisdom is not the foundation for ethics. It is ethics, samadhi, and wisdom. Having said that, though, it's not one-way influence. And that is, as you develop your abilities in samadhi, this enhances, supports ethics. As you develop greater wisdom, this supports and enhances samadhi, and so there's a synergy, among the three. But overall, this is the hierarchy. So now going to a very specific practice, I teach this a lot, I emphasize this a lot, but it must be stated that within the large framework of Buddhist meditative practices, which literally does include hundreds of different meditative practices, shamatha, I would say, is not the most important. It's one of many. But if one is missing the qualities of attention that you cultivate through shamatha, then none of the other practices will go very well. That is, if your mind is still very prone to laxity, jingwa, or excitation, gopa, none of the other practices, even the highest practices, dzogchen or vajrayana, the practice will be very high, the practitioner is quite low, in which case you don't get the fruit. And so there are two faculties or mental processes, and Rupert will have a lot to say about these later on, or at least as much as he wants to say, within the list of 48, 51, 52. But two mental faculties are utterly indispensable, for the practice of shamatha, and one of these is mindfulness. Now, here is a definition of mindfulness that is textually based, very long history, I think non-controversial, but it's not the same as the definition of mindfulness that one finds today in modern psychology. It's not to refute one, it's to say this is a broader umbrella, a larger term than the very specific definition that is used in John Kabat-Zinn's marvelous work in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and overall very, very commonly now in more and more studies. So here's one definition that is really quite common in broad strokes to the Theravada, to the Mahayana. This is not controversial and it's not sectarian. So mindfulness is a faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. Now the term in Pali, Sanskrit, and Tibetan, sati, smriti, tamba, has a large connotation or meaning of recollection. So mindfulness can be understood in three ways. And that is, I recollect what I had for breakfast this morning. We can call this retrospective mindfulness, looking back. I'm practicing mindfulness of breathing. I'm not remembering breaths I had yesterday. It's an ongoing flow of recollection, trying to overcome the dispersion, toa, of the mind. And so it's present-centered mindfulness, but it's very specifically focused on the sensations of the breath. So we have retrospective, we have present-centered, which is very central to shamatha, and then we also have prospective memory, maombalatupa. So for example, as you're in dream yoga, as you're falling asleep, you may create a very strong resolve, or pemba. Tonight when I'm dreaming, I will recognize that I'm dreaming. I will recognize the dream state as the dream state. You're sending your mindfulness into the future to remember to do something in the future when you're dreaming. So there's retrospective, present-centered, and prospective. The moment-to-moment awareness in the present moment is definitely a form of mindfulness, but it's one of those three. And it may be very focused on the sensations of the breath. It may be very open, as in open presence. There is mindfulness there, but it's not selective. So mindfulness is not at all in contradiction to or incompatible with samadhi. In fact, I believe it's impossible to develop samadhi without developing mindfulness. So there's one mental factor. There's, in this context, I'm calling this meta-attention.
How would you explain the perspective?
Yeah, because we dreamed before. We've dreamed before. We know what it's like to dream, and so... If you've never dreamed before, you couldn't imagine, when I'm dreaming, then I'll remember to do this. Notice. The other mental faculty, there are only two, it's not a long list, is
prospective.
prospective.
Can you So what would be the object of the mindfulness there if it's being recollected?
You already remember what it's like to dream, and when you have something like that again... So the other one is simply introspection.
Yeah, it's only saying that...
I myself am not very sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to make another number of hypotheses. I'm not simply reading from the text and telling you what everybody agrees on. So I've heard this one, although actually from one Theravada master, Baok Sayadaw, mentioned prospective memory. So the other mental faculty is the shiji, or introspection. But now in the context of shamatha, you're really monitoring the meditative process of practicing shamatha. So I'm calling it meta-attention, because it's a monitoring of the attention process, and it's very specific. So here's the definition. In this context, There's much broader meta-introspection, but now within shamatha, what you're specifically focusing on is, here is the faculty of monitoring the quality of attention, swiftly recognizing whether it has succumbed or fallen to either excitation or laxity. That's really the primary function of introspection. It's to be used and to be refined. Because as you develop along the path of shamatha, you must learn how to recognize subtler and subtler and subtler excitation and laxity. So that means you not only utilize it, but you must refine it to a very sharp edge. So what are the results of this? Of applying and cultivating mindfulness and introspection or meta-attention. In the classic texts, they really speak of two qualities of attention that are specifically or explicitly cultivated. The stability and vividness, necha and secha. Having taught shamatha for about 33 years to Westerners, I found, and also myself, in my own practice, yes. I did my first retreat up here almost 30 years ago. His Holiness was my guide in that practice. And I went in with great determination, very strong willpower. Yes. And I was thinking I must apply the first type of attention, which in Tibetan is called tsiruwa yilajaba, squeezing attention. And I got up to my meditation hut. And so dimbadan, tsiruwa means squeezing. So I thought, I know a lot about squeezing. So I got up in my hut practicing 10 hours a day, starting at 3:30 in the morning, and I said, I will squeeze. And of course, you all know, I didn't. But of course, after a very short time, you get totally stressed out, uptight. All the joy goes from the practice. You've been trying very hard, but then you hit a ceiling and you go nowhere. You're just getting sicker and sicker. And so as myself as a Westerner, teaching Westerners, there is a point so that we can be more like a Tibetan nomad 100 years ago. In general, maybe a bit more relaxed. Not driving cars at 70 miles an hour, not multitasking like in the modern world. First of all, learning how to be more like a Tibetan. Traditional Tibetan, not a modern Tibetan. Or a rural Indian 1,000 years ago. More relaxed, just looser, because we find references to lucha, relaxation, but not very strongly emphasized. In the shamatha, I think for the modern world, we must strongly emphasize it. And out of relaxation, then stability. Out of stability, vividness. So once again, there's a kind of hierarchy. But first of all, relax, be happy. And then stability, a bit more effort. And then out of stability, then the vividness. So there's a hierarchy. And then as with the Shila Samadhi Prajna, the ethics, samadhi, and wisdom, it's not just a hierarchy. As your mind grows calmer, more stable, you become more relaxed. As your mind becomes more vivid, this helps a lot for stability, because when you're very vivid, you're very interested. And if you're very interested in something, it's easier to stay on track. So those are the three qualities. This I would call the technology, contemplative technology of Buddhism, because you're taking your attention and refining it so that you can use it for the acquisition of wisdom, but also cultivating qualities, virtues that we all value. That is, with your ability to shamatha, you'll be much more efficient in cultivating loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, and so forth. And they in turn will help you in your shamatha. So the point here, though, the connection between shamatha and vipassana is a statement often quoted, including in the Kamalashila, the Bhavanakrama. The mind established in equipoise discovers reality. So, and so there's the connection between this kind of contemplative technology and what I think the scientists were quite content to say, contemplative inquiry or contemplative investigation. That I agree on too. So there are dozens of different shamatha methods, and both in the Theravada tradition and in the Mahayana tradition, different types of practices are prescribed, almost like a doctor prescribing a medication for people with different temperaments. I have selected out of the dozens of different methods of shamatha, I've selected 3 that we used in the shamatha project, and this Cliff Saran will tell us a lot more about very soon, but this was comprised of 2 3-month retreats with actually a total number of 70 people. In the retreat, 60 people were subjects in the scientific study, and having experimented with these 3 methods, all of them very traditional. So I am not, frankly, interested in devising entirely new methods of Buddhism. I think it's fine to do that. I'm not interested. I'm much more interested in selecting methods that clearly are effective in the modern world, and possibly some minor adaptation, like relaxing first. And so I've selected these three. The first one primarily from the Theravada tradition, the actual method, but it's practiced in all major schools. The second one we're calling observing the mind. And so in this one, and I'll get to this later, but it's observing the events of the mind, thoughts, mental imagery, and so forth. And finally, perhaps most... But this really isn't, the second one really does entail attending to the space of the mind, that domain of experience, and the thoughts, the images, and so forth that arise within that domain. And you maintain an ongoing flow of mindfulness there while introspectively observing the quality of your attention. Now there's a simpler practice, and it's a subtler practice, and that is just awareness of awareness. In Tsongkhapa's terms, you're simply attending to the sel-tsam, rik-tsam, the sheer luminosity, the sheer cognizance of awareness. You're not even looking at thoughts, images. You're simply resting. It said, rikpa rangsar nepa. You're letting your awareness rest in its own place and simply being aware of being aware. So it's withdrawn from even the contents of the mind. And this too is a shamatha practice. And in fact, it was taught clearly by the Buddha Shakyamuni in the Pali Canon, Vijnana Kasina. And he spoke of this as a very, very deep practice of shamatha. So I have taught these a lot. I find that one or more of these tend to be very accessible and very beneficial to a lot of people. So I selected these three, but all of these are additional. These are nothing new from me. So in terms of now just a very brief account, mindfulness of breathing. And I want to now explicitly tie this in with David's account from the cognitive psychology of long-term memory. And so when you are practicing mindfulness of breathing, you have to remember what the instructions are, which means you must have heard them at one point. And so when you're first sitting down, in the Tibetan they say the first stage is achieved by the power of hearing, which is instruction. Where are you supposed to focus your attention? What posture do you have? So this is long-term memory. Maybe you received the instruction 1 week ago. So you must be remembering that. That's long-term memory while you're practicing. And so it's a retrospective mindfulness. If you don't have the retrospective mindfulness, you'll sit there and not know what you're supposed to do because you completely forgot the instruction, right? And so that's one aspect. But there's also present-centered mindfulness of the breathing. And so in the Theravada tradition, the sensations here at the apertures of the nostrils, you're not looking backwards, you're not looking forwards. The sensations arising from moment to moment, but very focused. So it's not open to whatever sensations come up, but it is maintaining the continuity, the non-forgetfulness of your attention focused right here. And that's where stability comes in. Stability, we can say, is temporal continuity. Over time, and so there is present-centered mindfulness. And so these are the two aspects of mindfulness here, recalling the instructions and in the present moment, focusing on the sensations of the breath. And then there is the introspection, the metacognitive awareness of the ongoing flow of attention. And this, I've already said it, so I'll now be very brief. You're specifically attending to the possible occurrence of laxity or excitation. And then if you recognize it, then you must apply will, intention. Then you must have intention and remember what are the antidote, apply the antidote, and so it's rather like a sailor trimming the sails as the winds shift so that you are sailing well. This remains constant. That is, the practice, even though the objects of mindfulness will shift from one method to another, introspection always has the same job in the practice of shamatha. It's not different. But you must, of course, remember how this is to be done. Now we have this second practice, which is, frankly, overall, it's more subtle. This observing the mind. And so, and this is really attending to a particular domain of experience. So you're not attending to visual, auditory, any of the 5 physical senses. But you are attending to an immediate content of experience, the thoughts, images, and so forth that arise in that mental domain of experience. That is your object of mindfulness. And so your mindfulness is present-centered. That is, after you remembered, what the instructions are, it is present-centered, and it's real-time mindfulness, and I'll explain this, real-time mindfulness of the space of the mind, the domain, and I put this in quotation marks, objective contents, such as discursive thoughts, mental images, and dream events. Now, something that David did not allude to, and I think he was well representing his own discipline, but a term I never heard, was mental perception. When he spoke of perception, he spoke of 5 sensory perception, and then the perception of our balance, movement, and so forth, but there was no reference to mental perception. And that is our ability to directly perceive events that you do not detect by means of your 5 physical senses. Now, I would argue, now here's my hypothesis, because I think there's some controversy here. I don't speak with authority. But for example, in a dream, especially a lucid dream, in the midst of a lucid dream where you're recognizing the dream as the dream, here it's very evident that you're directly perceiving mental facsimiles, mental facsimiles of visual form, mental facsimiles of sound, of even smell, of taste, of touch. And they're appearing to you objectively in the dream. They're appearing to you as objects in the dream. You're not simply remembering them, you're directly perceiving right now what is manifesting, and I will call that mental perception. And so I would suggest... So this is controversial, but I will put this out. Maybe it's completely wrong. But my sense is, clearly, you don't infer the immediate concept of the dream. You're not simply remembering past images. These are fresh, unprecedented dreams. Although, of course, if you are born blind, you will not dream in color. So you'll not dream with visual form. It's not only mental perception, but I would say your direct access to the forms and so forth in the dream. It's not just inference, it's not just memory. I would propose that there is certainly conceptualization. But there's also mental perception. And so if this is the case, and His Holiness has not objected yet, if this is the case, if we can agree that we are mentally perceiving objective appearances within the dream, I would suggest this is not only while you're dreaming, but when you're meditating. And you're focusing on the space of the mind, and you will objectively observe mental images arising, spontaneously. You will mentally hear chit-chat or discursive thoughts just arising. And you may even have other mental images arise as well. And so discursive thoughts, mental images, but this is present-centered, it's real-time, and I would suggest, again, a hypothesis, is that your perception of, let's say, a mental image. When I said I could visualize an image of a banana above David's head, I would suggest, here's another hypothesis, that, your head didn't go down, that the appearance of the banana, the mental image of the appearance of the banana is simultaneous, dunyam, with my mental perception of it. In other words, it's not first the appearance and then I get it later, but in fact, it's real-time. Hypothesis.
And the yiki don't you legend David Golia Gala something. Nikele that's so near of Lord Charge. The Chumber del maybe Muslim Chachores, Yijum Muslim. Can Yijum Muslim to any the sound, you did and you change Sheba Tunyam. Toboyana, you didn't troop anything called Tungachine, Mungur, Topote. It's complicated.
So this will be unpacked. Again, I'm not speaking with authority. So the burden's off me. There is another type of mindfulness here. That is, I'm free to make mistakes and I'll be corrected. That's what I'm saying by that. But there's another type of mindfulness that takes place here that I find is very interesting, and that is you're attending to the space of the mind, and you may observe, experience, recognize emotions arising. You may observe.
The Juntes left it to much but totally.
But the minimum knowledge of minimum knowledge. Minimum knowledge the now the judging minimum you would have his being so strong.
Could need it to go out now to Yam Shach.
Some of you are the his bit children have a billion, you know, should go to the year chose to. Then you go getting a channel,
So, continue.
Sure.
Another very interesting aspect of this practice is not simply attending to the objective appearances within the mind, but also paying attention to and recognizing emotions arising. Anger, sadness, fear, and also recognizing desires arising. My hypothesis here is that when we're observing an emotion or a desire, this is actually retrospective, but in terms of working memory, so very short-term memory, and such that the emotion that you're recognizing is a gechingama, is one that arose just a couple of moments before. Could be milliseconds before, 20, 50 milliseconds. But in fact, it's retrospective, but very short-term. And so but when you recognize the desire, at that moment you're not having the desire, because the desire is going to be for something. So the desire will be focused on what you desire, but when you're observing the desire, that's the object of mindfulness and not the object of desire. Kechichimete, kechingamate tengyare. Samgido. Okay?
So this is like a recollection of an experience.
Yes, but you're right. Let's say in one moment I'm experiencing sadness. In the next moment, I have a retrospective mindfulness of that sadness, but I'm looking at the past moment and not the same moment. So it's very subtle. And we really are going into Buddhist mind moment notice here. That orientation. The movement of cognition, the movement of consciousness is very fast. So many things can take place within 1 second. Right? Metacognition is the same, so I won't comment. This very interesting practice of awareness is also called samamebe shine. So without a sign, or demebe shine, mipa mebe shine. So without a support, without a basis, but you're not attending to anything other than awareness. So the awareness of awareness is not taking anything else, any appearance to the mind as an object, not even thoughts or emotions. It's simply, as I said earlier, it is resting simply, the interest is simply in the experience of being aware. Awareness of awareness. I would suggest, again, in terms of very precise analysis, a single moment of awareness is not taking itself as its object, but the later moment takes a preceding moment of awareness as its object, so it's very short-term working memory. So working memory, and then we have metacognition. It's the same. So those are the 3 methods we focused on in the shamatha project, and many people find, pretty much everybody I taught found that they get a lot of benefit from at least one method or another. Many people, interestingly, would start with mindfulness of breathing or observing the mind, and they naturally wanted to move, after some months, to awareness of awareness. Out of the shamatha project, we have now 6 people who are continuing to practice about 10 hours a day. All of them now have gone to awareness of awareness. Not because I pushed them, they naturally felt inclined. So David had bad news. I put bad news as objections to introspection. Not that it's a bad idea altogether, but is it possible, is it viable to introduce this first person observing one's own mental states and so processes and so forth, to incorporate this into the scientific framework? Or is it just not possible because science is objective and this is very subjective? So I'll give a short list here. I think David's was longer, and I will not try to answer them all here, but raise them. And I will suggest that Buddhism has addressed these problems, these difficulties, and has, to my mind, have given very substantial responses to them. And so the first one, and all of these I've heard from people, I didn't make any of these up, and that is that introspective observations, what we actually observe with mental perception, is unstable and impossible to verify. So if I'm sitting practicing shamatha, And so if I'm sitting and practicing...
objective
So the first objection, and none of these are trivial or silly. I think all of these are very serious and important qualms, concerns. So the first of these is unstable. Well, I would say if you've stabilized your attention, that might help. Impossible to verify is if I should be practicing shamatha, and then I tell my teacher, let's say Jimbala, I can now maintain my attention with unwavering mindfulness for 1/2 hour, and I never lose the object in 1/2 hour. How does he know? Maybe because I have a very nice, happy face, or he thinks I'm a very honest person, but clearly, just by looking at me, he's not just going to take my word for it. No scientist would do that. And so is this an insurmountable problem? Well, I think traditionally, that is for the last 2,500 years of Buddhism, such meditation will be done, in many cases, in close dialogue with a meditation master who has ways of evaluating not just the person's speech, but the teacher will ask questions, very insightful questions, to draw out. The teacher will observe the student's behavior, and students may also talk among themselves. As we had in the Shamatha project, there was a lot of cross-referencing, and after 3 months in a retreat, the meditators were using terms that I think they, to a large extent, understood among themselves, whereas people who were not in that retreat or had never meditated, they did not know what they're talking about. They would just be empty words, stable, vivid, but would not have the referent. So it's an interesting one, but the impossibility to verify, I think we are now in an unprecedented situation. And that is, on the one hand, we can rely upon the time-tested methods of Buddhism, student-teacher relationship, and so forth, but now also we have various types of behavioral methods to determine whether a person is maintaining stability, behavioral methods using computer screens and various types of measurements to check vividness, and over time, there may be, it's speculation, but it's not impossible, we may find neurocorrelates of attentional stability, attentional vividness. And so by the time you bring in brain science and behavioral science and very rigorous first-person observation, you might have a contemplative science that is truly scientific because 2 aspects are already science, and the third one becomes scientific because it's becoming more and more rigorous. So maybe I'm speaking too much about that, but that's one. Now, here's, I think, almost a silly one, but I think this was posed by a person who's never meditated. But I've heard this. Introspection observations are useful only for understanding meditative states, but not for understanding ordinary or pathological. Pathological mental states. Anybody who's
but it's only for saying that in a way we are using kind of introspective awareness all the time.
We are. We must. And so this is, again, shows why it's quite... This actually is maybe the silliest, but I have heard it from a non-silly person. And that is when you... But anybody who's meditated, even for a day, knows that you don't simply slip into a meditative state and remain there all day with a happy smile. And that is, if you're meditating, you're practicing vipassana, you're practicing shamatha, you're practicing any type of meditation, this will arouse a wide array of emotions, of desires, of sadness, all kinds of things. So you're not just going into a meditative state and getting insight only into that. Especially the practice of observing the mind is famous for bringing forth to consciousness many old memories, desires, emotions, including fear, anger, craving, sadness, excitation, boredom. And so you get a very broad array. And it's not just with Sheshin, because this is nanglimipe tenpa. Nanglimipe, just nanglimipe yikingunsum. It's not just introspection in a narrow sense, but really observing rigorously one's own mental states and processes. And so you definitely, this one, to my mind, it's definite. You don't just get insight into meditative states. In fact, you may have insight into a wide variety of mental states. Here's one I just heard recently, and that is introspection is subject to, or looking inward is subject to contamination by theory. I think this is, again, somewhat naive. as if scientific observations have no contamination by theory. That would have to be an extremely primitive level of observation. Reading, if Cliff shows me the latest fMRI scan, he said, "Look, Alan, can't you see what I see?" And I say, "Yes, I see a psychedelic oval image. This is really nice." And so he have to learn how to. Now this is a serious objection in terms of the collapse of the introspective movement from about 1875 to 1910. Introspection was used, and then it was pretty much discarded in academic psychology because there were many internal problems, and one of the very famous problems was in one laboratory, the investigator would almost be suggesting what people should be seeing, and then they would see what he or she had said, and so that is contaminated. That's true. But I would suggest it doesn't have to be that way. Theory can be used to illuminate and not merely to bias. And so that's where you really are trying to approach a contemplative science and not a contemplative indoctrination, where you're only aimed at seeing what you should see. Then you don't need to meditate, you just memorize. Then you have, this is a very interesting one. Introspective observations are subject to phenomenological illusion, and that is that appearances and reality are different, right? Well, if we actually knew the nature, if scientifically we knew the nature of subjectively experienced mental images, desires, emotions, then we could compare the appearances of these with reality. But the problem is, we don't. We know the neural correlates, but no one has ever demonstrated that neural correlates are identical to the subjective experience. That's a hypothesis, never been tested, never been validated. And so I will say that's an untested.
ina lebanam ju mendawan digi sheban di chungu yore se ku didan jigu jang re se ka she la ba ma da ti dubje zan me ba.
And so since we don't know the nature, that is scientifically, we don't yet know the nature of consciousness or other subjective experiences, therefore to say the appearances are, how do you say, misleading, I think we have no basis for saying that. And one could similarly say to Galileo that what you're observing through the telescope, in fact, is not what's simply out there, because what you're seeing are images created in part by your brain. But if he had stopped there and say, "Oh, well, I will stop observing these images created by my brain," we'd have no astronomy. And so we deal with the appearances, we take them seriously, because to not look at them at all is then a dead end. Quickly now, this is a very interesting one from Freud. That is, our observations are subject to concealment, misrepresentation, by unconscious mental processes. For example, I don't want to think of myself as an angry person. I want to think of myself a very nice person. Anger comes up. I say, that's not anger, that's compassion. So I repress it or I interpret it accordance to my self-notion. That is certainly a possibility. And then finally, this is most interesting one, they're all most interesting to me, you can tell, that introspective observations are subject to distortion due to observer participancy, and that is observing the mental event influences it. This is absolutely central to all observations made in quantum mechanics. It is not
Quantum mechanics.
Quantum physics. Observer participancy is at the core of all observations made in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is regarded by many as the most successful of all physical theories in history. Therefore, it did not disqualify quantum mechanics. It should not disqualify introspection. Introspection, I will wrap up quickly. Introspection, I would say, is indispensable, whether you're a cognitive neuroscientist, a behavioral psychologist, because we cannot fully explain what it means to be conscious or to experience a mental state solely or exclusively by use of physics and biology. We must bring in the first person. And I think I will leave it at that. I mean, there's an interest that it must involve observation. This has been the great strength of science since the time of Galileo. If you want to understand something, any natural phenomenon, you observe it as carefully as you can. if you want to understand states of consciousness, mental processes, in accordance with the whole scientific tradition, observe them as carefully as you can. And don't say, oh, observation is no good here, we'll just study brain correlates, or we'll just study behavior because we're more comfortable, because they're objective and physical. So I'll skip Einstein. He said, you won't get it just by logic. And this is what distinguished Galileo from the philosophers of the medieval period, wanted to get everything with logic, and he got out his telescope, and that actually started modern science as we know it. Buddhist and scientific complementarity, I think, is obvious. I'm not going to elaborate. David already very well addressed it. And we come to open questions. So but I'm not going to try to answer these. That's why they're called open. The relevance of ethics for refining the mind. Of ethics, the cultivation of mental balance, or samadhi, but including also these qualities of the heart, of loving kindness and so forth. What is the relevance of these and one's worldview for the practice of contemplative science, that is rigorously investigating the mind from a first-person perspective in full collaboration with the third-person methods of modern science. And that is, it's widely affirmed in Buddhism, you will not develop a very high level of samadhi if your way of life is very destructive, or if your mind is still strongly succumbing to what are called the 5 hindrances, like sensual craving, ill will, and so forth. You will not achieve. So ethics is built into the system, but also worldview. Maybe it's not an accident that the 6 people who are continuing out of 70 people, still practicing now for almost 2 years, 10 hours a day, all of them have a Buddhist worldview. Maybe that's not an accident. And so there may be some worldviews that are more supportive for meditation and others less. A very interesting one for those of us involved in practice is, can traditional achievements of mental training, such as shamatha and discovery, contemplative insights, vipassana, can these be replicated, again, done in the modern world, not just by tulkus, not just by people who are born with great realization, but by very ordinary people, like this one here, raised in the West, not in a Buddhist monastery or in a Buddhist culture. Is it possible, or are we too late? Are we too late? Say, so sorry, Buddha Dhamma has degenerated now, you have no chance. So, it's a real question. His Holiness, if I can say, this is a nice short story, very short, but I heard that about 35 years ago, one fellow I knew from Europe had an audience with His Holiness, and he was being very sad, saying, all these times are so degenerate. Now there's no possibility of gaining deep realization. And what this fellow told me, I heard through the grapevine, is His Holiness responded, nowadays, if you practice like Milarepa, a great Tibetan yogi, you will achieve like Milarepa. But if you just think degenerate, then not so much success. So, but it's an open question. But it's an open question. We have these wonderful descriptions of 9 stages of shamatha, achieving the 4 measurables of loving kindness and so forth. Wonderful descriptions. But is anybody realizing this today? And will anybody actually report, or will they all say, oh, I have no realization, I have no realization? So it's an open question. Now here's an interesting one. To what extent might science be helpful? I think, to my mind, not in creating new methods, but taking the methods that are already there and optimizing them, making them most effective. Can we, with the input of science, finding, oh, well, among 60 people, people practicing this method had better success, these people had less success. These people were also doing preliminary practices, Mundgod, they had better or worse success. But getting feedback from third-person perspective, might this help us to select and maybe adapt Buddhist practices so they're most effective for people in the modern world? And now we have only 3 more points and I'm finished. Collaborating a lot with mind scientists, neuroscientists, people in the biological sciences, I hear like every day that we are intent on understanding the mind purely in terms of biology. That all mental states really are physical, not necessarily atomic, but they are functions of the physical, they are emergent properties of the physical, and this is commonplace. It's stated pretty much everywhere. I think it would be helpful to bring in 21st century physics. If you're going to reduce everything to physics, to the physical, make sure you're not stuck in the late 19th century. But bring it to 2009, where the very category of the physical has become very elusive. When 90%, 96% of the gravitational forces in the universe are unknown, because they're attributed to dark matter and dark energy, this is a very large gap, that it's still called physical, even though nothing is known about it at all. So I call this materialism of the gaps, instead of God of the gaps, but it's a 96% gap. And so what does physical even mean now? And I think we shouldn't go back to the 19th century, to the good old days, when physics means little atoms only. Bring in the physicists. Our physicalist assumptions, the assumption that the mind is nothing more than a physical emergent property, function, or part of the brain, and this is very provocative, but I mean it with respect, are these assumptions necessary or even helpful for a full scientific understanding of the mind? Or if we shaved off all of those assumptions and just said we don't know, in other words, use Buddha's razor. So Occam's razor was used to shave off, you'll have to fill in here. Occam's razor.
라 말에 또 뭐 친구부 대세자베 갈라스 아니 대세자베 갈이야 뭐통다 리벤 주마토에게 아니 다다 진짜 담에다만 여바 시샤진 대세자고요 말스 대세자베 갈라 이 시샤제에 강한 용용치 거래스 그때 오감스 레서스 거 그때나신 코란스나 대세바담제 수진레 삼성 그 다단데 and Buddha razor. So
Occam's razor was used very effectively to shave off medieval assumptions and open the way for modern science. Buddha's razor of shaving off physicalist assumptions may be very useful for opening up a contemplative science. Because I don't see that any science is lost by discarding those assumptions. The science is still really good science. We're just throwing out the assumptions. Final point. I often hear, even as Holiness said this morning, we should exclude religious aspects of Buddhism from this type of dialogue. I agree. We might say metaphysical as in the sense that this is beyond the scope of experiential inquiry. Beyond the scope. So metaphysical beyond, it's more for philosophers and religious people. What I would suggest, though, is it's very easy to absolutize the category of metaphysical. That is, if it's metaphysical for me, it must be metaphysical for everybody. If it's metaphysical for science, it must be metaphysical for Buddhists. I would suggest that is simply not the case. And that is the distance from the earth to the moon is metaphysical for a Buddhist yogi. 237,000 miles, I've never seen that in a Buddhist text. It's metaphysical. For a Tibetan yogi, for modern science, that's not metaphysical at all, right? So we know that there are things that are metaphysical for the yogi that are not metaphysical for modern physics and so forth, that is, they are within range of experiential inquiry. Then we can ask, are there issues from the Buddhist side that are known directly, especially using the telescope of the mind, the samadhi, that are known directly by the Buddhist yogi, but are metaphysical for the neuroscientist? And that is, the category of metaphysical may be culturally relative. It's metaphysical for one culture and direct knowledge for another.
And that you want to explain what you mean by metaphysical?
Metaphysical is very close to Shinto-gokyo. Shinto-gokyo. Ngunski takji chep mi tuba. Eneng motoki jepaki. Takji chep mi tuba. Right? Bena kyadasa di lendeki. Lendeki dewa tashitawa. Metaphysical Shinto-gokyo. And so, really that which is beyond cogent logic. So a lot of scientific conclusions are drawn by very strong logic and mathematics. It's not considered metaphysical, right? Like black holes are not considered metaphysical, but no one's ever directly observed one. But by inference, very powerful inference, scientists believe in black holes, right?
Maybe this is something we can pick up in the dialogue.
Really
we have a philosopher here, so
yeah.
metaphysical versus...
But it's a question, is this the category of metaphysical, is it absolute, that it's true for all cultures at all times? I don't believe so. I think it is relative, and even in the 19th century, the existence of atoms was metaphysical for physics. They had no way of testing the existence of atoms in the late 19th century. Only in the first decade of the 20th century, with Rutherford, did it enter into the realm of experiential inquiry, empirical inquiry. Now the existence of atoms is not metaphysical. In the 19th century, it was metaphysical. Right? And so it's relative not only to culture, but to time. And so I'm not willing to accept the Western category of metaphysical and say, therefore, it must be metaphysical for Buddhists also. So I am finished. Finished.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Alan, you actually answered all the objections to introspection yourself, basically. I would like to ask if maybe you have some other objections that maybe could feed into the dialogue.
Well, I have. Is this working?
Should
It
be.
appears not to be working.
It's not working right now.
No, I didn't. I don't think.
봐요, 너.
Just use the handheld. Yeah.
뭐 뒷바면, 뒷바요, 너. 뒷바도 왜?
주면도 다 돼도.
봐도 봐. 마우스 봐도.
And then off is done.
Is it doing anything now?
No.
I think you should use that. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, mine. It doesn't want me to talk.
No, it isn't.
So my STM, short-term memory, and LTM, long-term memory, are rather foggy at this point since I was up at 3:30 this morning trying to get ready, and therefore I won't be able to properly address the resolution of the objections, but I can say that some of the objections could be elaborated in ways that are perhaps a bit more difficult to dismiss. And I could also say that on my computer over right there are further ones if we wanted to spend the time opening it up. If we decide we want to go there, I would suggest I will pass the mic, open my machine, look at what's there, and we can come back to me subsequently. But meanwhile, let me offer a few remarks. There is the issue of empirical validation. And you used the example of repeated interaction between a teacher and a student as a basis for arriving at a kind of at least indirect validation about the truth of the reports that the student is making about the student's subjective experience. This leads to somewhat further concern regarding the utility of the first-person approach, because as part of any such validation, we are going to need to have the student be talking about or indicating in some other behavioral way what the content of the student's subjective experience is. And in order for one to know what to make out of the true meaning of these reports, we need to have developed a shared language where each of us knows about what the other is saying. The development of such a language is not nearly so easy as one might imagine, especially when the experience is being discussed by a speaker and a listener. Concern states of mind that are never in the first place generated by exposure to outside stimulation. If I am wanting to be talking about experiences that can only be generated internally, and then trying to communicate to you what my experiences are, and you have had such as well, but you don't know whether yours are like mine, in order for us to try to pin down whether or not they are identical, we have to come to some kind of agreement that there is an external source that is sufficiently similar in terms of generating internal states to what we're experiencing that we can then give that a label and start to talk about it. This is essentially what happens during the course of child language development. The mother teaches the child a language by making reference to external objects about which both the child and the parent, the mother, have input. If there is no such available input, if it's all internal, there is no way one can know for sure whether or not the words getting used are actually speaking about the same thing. And there is absolutely no way around this per se in a direct fashion. But, and this is where I'm now going to argue against me. Well, sure, I argue against myself all the time. That's what this task of life is about. You remember Jimmy Gilmore's song. He starts thinking one thing, he's building a house, and then he tears it apart. Well, that's what I'm doing now. I have my mental house that I've just constructed in terms of an argument, and I will proceed to deconstruct it. And the deconstruction involves bringing in data from brain imaging. So if we can create circumstances where two distinct individuals are making claims about the nature of their internal states, and it appears as if the language they are using to describe those states, even if they don't have any necessarily external reference, are equivalent, identical to each other, and in the context of that particular situation, you can also demonstrate that the patterns of their brain activity are essentially identical as well. Then this provides a kind of third-person evidence, and it's third-person evidence for them, as well as some other guy who's running, or gal who's running the fMRI machine, where I can hear you talking to me using language to describe your states. I'm using the same language for me to tell you about my states. I'm checking you out to make sure you're really on track with me, that you're conscious, you're telling the truth, you know what you're talking about, and how I do it is by looking at your brain images while you're looking at mine, and we look back and forth at each other's images and we say, yeah, we're on the same wavelength. And once we've done that and affirmed that the language getting used is appropriate in a consistent fashion, then we can continue to talk further and elaborate more on the extent to which we do or don't have these shared experiences. So that's one problem, back and forth. You wanted to know what I had to say about that. So I've told you the pro, I've told you the con. If you want to hear more, I would say more, otherwise I'll shut up.
Sorry. If I could respond to that very briefly. And that is... 1 minute?
Yeah. Oh, go. sem lope jo je nang ge nyong le da je je ge che do da zhen ba de xi xi be jo che ne che be zhong zhe le ya da tuan de tuan du yi ma yin ge je ba chi dan chi da xie che dan di da elen ge song ben da xie chi di o res ben nyam nyam len chi ni ge la ma la ge ji ti de tuan yo ba sa de no kuran sa na da chiri bo de xie ja ba ji li ya chi lo ge be third person ro chi lian de ba chi sa me na and ben ya lama to lama nang ku le ge ji go che ta nya ji go pe jo che be yin ne ne nyong ji go de shi de yu ma yu de che ba che to yo ma ro sa de le ya ta chi kar yo le na ta le be nam ju ta je and da bu ye ba tong be na du chi tu me ro sa ta kan da xin yang ku nang ku ko ra ja de ji ma do.
A brief response to this, and that is, Cliff made the comment very early in the Shamatha project that this whole Shamatha project was not designed to validate Buddhism. That Buddhists were not waiting 2,500 years to know whether we're doing okay. Buddhists had validated to their satisfaction with a tremendous number of accomplished yogis and so forth. So we're not waiting, are we okay? And then finally the scientist said, you're okay or you're not okay. And so, but what I would suggest in this regard is that none of these perspectives are infallible. And that is your own first-person evaluation of how you're doing in meditation is very important. But you can be mistaken. As a teacher myself, who's not clairvoyant, so I have no direct access to anybody's mind except for my own, as I'm evaluating student interaction, their reporting, I treat my own evaluations, which I wrote extensively, I'm fallible. The behavioral methodologies, I have to finish this though, the behavioral methods for which we have many, testing attention skills with regards to visual stimuli, this is not an infallible evaluation of what's happening when the person is in meditation. And looking at neural correlates is not infallible. So none of these are the final arbiter, the infallible, but by the time we bring in multiple ones, we can have a greater approximation of confidence than we'd have with only one alone. Final point in this regard is that in interaction between student and a meditation teacher, you're not just listening to the student. The student is often asking questions. You respond, and then the student may put into practice what you said. This is fundamentally pragmatic. And that is, they put into practice your instruction, they come back a week, a month later, they tell how it went. And then you get a sense, did I properly evaluate? Was that good advice? They say, it was useless, it was harmful, it was very helpful. And so it's a feedback system that, with a good teacher and a good student, gives increasing confidence on both parts, the student and the teacher, that they actually are validly communicating with each other. And the student's ability to evaluate his or her own experience should be getting better and better and better. Now, none of these are infallible, though, and I think that's an important point. Having said that, I would invite any scientist to tell me which of your observations are infallible. It's not a word that crops up.
Short answer to that, David?
I'm very reluctant to get into debate about this, other than the fact that Gelugs love to debate. So Galupa, yes. So you may have noticed that during your most eloquent, immediately preceding discourse, you said only you have direct access to your mind. But the fact of the matter is, even you don't have direct access to your mind. And you illustrated that previously by pointing out when you were introspecting regarding an emotion, you are actually introspecting regarding a memory of an emotion that has passed, and most likely will... What you are introspecting about is mental content that consists of memories that are already at least probably a few hundred milliseconds old. They are most likely to have already started decaying, falling apart like the 5 skandhas, and disrupting themselves in ways that you no longer can for sure trust as being an accurate, I hate to use representation, but that's what it actually is, of the state of your mind at the time that that content originally arose. And this is inescapable and is related to very deep theorems from mathematics proven by first Kurt Gödel and subsequently Alan Turing, to the effect that logical systems, of which we are very sophisticated examples, can never know and prove everything there is to be true about themselves. It is literally, logically impossible for all sentient beings except those who are enlightened. In their case, they are not in some sense introspecting about themselves. They have become themselves completely in the true, full sense. So they are knowing about themselves by being themselves, but that is not the same thing as doing the introspection. So until you have become enlightened, Alan, you will never truly have direct access.
And I would say, in a similar fashion, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. None of you neuroscientists have direct access to the brain. It's always by way of visual imagery, MRI, and so forth. So direct means when you're having a dream, you're directly observing the contents of the dream, as direct as it gets. As direct as it gets when a neuroscientist looks at the brain.
As direct as it gets.
You're looking at the brain by way of your visual imagery generated by your own brain. So that's not direct either. So I'm saying as direct as it gets. And I have privileged access to my mental states that, not being clairvoyant, I don't have to yours. This sets aside the possibility.
But I do have to yours.
Namo. Please, we move on.
Can I ask a question? I would like to ask. Oh, I'm sorry, Karmapa.
Go ahead, Amish.
I'd like to ask this to His Holiness and the others in the room about if the goal, when you started out talking, Alan, you were talking about ethics and virtuous qualities. If the goal of these practices is to become more wholesome, more virtuous, more compassionate, if those are the goals of the practices, do we care if we have a correct assessment of the mechanism by which we achieve them?
Do you mean my mechanism is not a word used much in Buddhism?
Well, let me say what I mean by that. So, actually, just referring to David's talk earlier today, he mentioned that one way in which we might achieve sustained attention stability is that we can go for longer periods of time of holding the object of concentration. That could be one view of how you think you're achieving more stability.
Great.
I have an alternative hypothesis, that it's not that you're improving the duration of holding the object, you're improving the ease with which you return when you're distracted. Both are potential ways in which you achieve the same experience. Does it matter which is correct if the experience leads you to becoming more compassionate?
Do they need to preclude each other?
Well, I'm just saying we're arguing about something about a state of reality. What's the reality? But if the reality is, regardless of how it happens, you are indeed more compassionate, do we care?
me. 탐제 시에서디 탐제 김에 민토비하기 대실로서 뭐 주부도 탐제 시야 여말보다 하다가 뒤쳐지도 해야 되지 자 하는데 어디 그래 전주 고아야 되거든 아니 현지 캘라마디 실수지 분신 매자 싱마리스 라 근데 랑기 뭐 타제네 수시 타요 그래서 제가 쉬우직 쉬우사고 간신다 고주 그들이 되고 다들 저기 그 가서래 영접이네 그 다쳐지네 버는 내가 찍기도 하네 다져 돼야 말을 그 게망불로 되네 다져 가지고 근데 지금 하네 이렇게 가서래 밑자적건데 시야 돼야 민두디 처바로 재미는 저기 자정업 주네 게네 다 그게 저지도는 다 배지 거래를 힘으로 차시하소 그래 맞아 자서 뭐 precisely 다 도서야지 배지 가고
His Holiness was saying that listening to this ongoing debate, it reminded him of a passage in a text by a 12th century, 13th century, I think late 12th century Indian master who came to Tibet, Jayananda, and commenting upon the kind of the impossibility of developing a reasoning system that is, that would lead to conclusive proof of something, particularly in relation to the presence of mind and other. So Jayananda says that, you have only two avenues of gaining knowledge. One is direct experience, perception. The other one is through inference. And as to the direct perception, unless you have a clairvoyance, you will have no access to what the other person is thinking, what your opponent is thinking. And as for inference, then there will be a kind of an infinite regress. So what this point... And he also says that even with regard to one's own standpoints, whatever conclusions you may have arrived at, there's always the possibility that it could be erroneous, it could be wrong. So in other words, what you can get is at best is approximate knowledge. So what this suggests is that with regard to many of these issues that we are discussing, first of all, it's unreasonable to expect answer, even in a given issue, simply by looking at that phenomenon itself. You need a much greater integration of understanding from many different angles that has some bearing upon the phenomena that you are discussing. So that's one important point. So here the Buddhist principle of dependent origination becomes very important, being understanding all the interconnections and relations. And then you need to have a much better kind of comprehensive perspective, holistic perspective. And the second thing is to expect 100% conclusive proof. Again, conclusive knowledge is again unrealistic. At best, we will have to deal with maybe greater than 50%. So it's really, at some level, it's a pragmatic decision. When we talk about knowledge, it's really a pragmatic decision we have to make. And then maybe you can use divinations, throwing the dice. Throwing the dice.
Michi, I can give you a short response from shamatha, and that is when you're first starting out, the classic descriptions say you'll spend most of your time distracted. During the first stage, the second, most of the time distracted. So it's very much a matter of being distracted for shorter periods of time. The Buddhist hypothesis is if you follow very far on this path, out of 9 stages, you get to the 8th stage. At that point, you're not distracted anymore. There is no distraction, which means now you can discontinue the introspection and let your flow of mindfulness be continuous, uninterrupted even by introspection. This is multitasking until then, because you're focusing on the object and then you're breaking it, monitoring the meditative process. These are 2 different tasks. When you get very advanced, the 8th stage, it is said, no more interruption by distraction, no more use for introspection. You can use it later. And now it's just a flow of mindfulness, in which case it's no longer a case of bringing the attention back because the impulse to pull it away is finished. For the time being, it's not an irreversible achievement. You can achieve shamatha and you can lose it. So that's reversible. Yes. The question is inspection of what I just said. In this lifetime, if you achieve shamatha, which is achieving an exceptional state of mental balance with strong physiological shift, by the Buddhist account, very strong physiological shift, that is, could you lose it in this lifetime? His Holiness thinks probably so. From my studies, quite clearly so, but certainly now the Buddhist framework, from lifetime to lifetime, you could achieve it in this lifetime, future lifetime. Buddhist framework, you could definitely lose it in future lifetime. But we just bracket that. But that is a Buddhist. It's not an irreversible. I think no Buddhist school says, you achieve shamatha, now forever you'll have shamatha. You can lose it.
Well, I just wanted to, I have to ask again because I think that the point of my question maybe wasn't clear. I want to just state it again. That let's say that we were completely, the stages that we progressed through to get to the goal state, okay? Let's say by all accounts we've achieved the goal state. Does it matter if we didn't follow the stages that you describe? So that's what I meant by mechanism. If the way in which we get to the desired way of being, our minds to be wholesome, our actions and thoughts to be more compassionate, if we're at that state, does the root really matter?
the classic Buddhist descriptions state that you will progress through those 9 stages. Some very rapidly, some very slowly, some with major obstacles. But you'll not simply jump from stage 2 to stage 7. That you will progress, because they consider it quite an organic, natural, that the degree of excitation will gradually subside, the degree of vividness will gradually increase, and so forth. And so you don't just jump, but it can happen very quickly. So that's the classic. Having said that, that's a hypothesis. As from a scientific perspective, that's a hypothesis. Maybe it can be proven wrong. But for the time being, that is our hypothesis. That those are the stages of development.
Clarification. So the physiological state you talked about, the change, can you describe that?
I can describe what is stated. So at no point am I speaking, I'm a great yogi speaking from my experience. That never happens. But I have studied the texts, and I think they are not just speculation. I have a strong confidence that these are reports of people who have achieved shamatha. And along the path of developing shamatha, not just at the end point, but along the path, and I've seen this among my own students, that there are, from a first-person perspective, we cannot speak about the third person, because these kind of studies have not been done yet, of a 2-year longitudinal study. It would be fascinating to do, but not yet done. But people find first person, that as you're developing properly along the path, not only are you becoming more relaxed, the mind becoming more stable, more vivid, but the body starts to become lighter, feeling lighter, more buoyant. You can sit for longer periods, 2-3 hours, with no discomfort. And this is, I have some students right now, they can do that for 2 or 3 hours, no discomfort, and they're meditating 10-12 hours a day. They could not do that earlier. So something is shifting in the body where they can sit in a very proper position for long periods of time, in between sessions, a lightness, a buoyancy of the body, and that's still on the path. Now, Tsongkhapa is especially clear, I think, in showing that when you actually achieve shamatha, it's not just getting a little bit better. There is a discontinuity, something quite abrupt, something quite memorable takes place. And he describes it from a first-person perspective as, first of all, having a feeling as if somebody's placing a palm on your bald head. A kind of pressure, so straight first-person report. Nothing metaphysical about this at all, if you've had the experience. And that is, it's like a pleasant pressure on the top of your head, as if somebody's placing a hand on your bald head. This is an indicator that there's a shift taking place in the mind. So it must have something to do with the brain, who knows? But it's suggesting that you're shifting into a mental pliancy. And as a technical term, prashrabda, perhaps Rupert will tell us more about it later, but a buoyancy, a malleability, a pliancy, that you can really feel that like you're a mental gymnast, that you could do whatever you like with a mind. This takes place, this catalyzes, it's top-down, that is mind to body. You feel it subjectively, mentally. This catalyzes or triggers a feeling of pliancy in the body. You feel as if you could levitate. You can't, but you feel so light, and there's a sense of just malleability, of suppleness, of smoothness in the body. You experience that, and then out of that, you experience a bliss, and the bliss actually saturates the entire body. You get blissed out temporarily. And they're understanding this in terms of the flows of energy from a first-person perspective, and then the bliss just saturates your body, really quite ecstasy, and almost like a pot that's bubbling over, then it flows into the mind, and you feel a mental ecstasy. So it's quite distinct, physical then mental. While you're in that state of mental ecstasy, you really can't do much. You couldn't work on a math problem, right? Or something like that. You're pretty much blissed out. But then it gradually tapers off. And it becomes much more calm, still very pleasant, a sense of well-being. But now if you want to do a math problem or go to some other form of meditation, you can, right? So that's a fairly close description, all first person. And what would be utterly fascinating from my perspective is to do a longitudinal study for however long it takes, from people from very beginning stages, map what is happening physiologically overall in the body, what's happening in the brain, try to map that to these 9 stages, and then have a person, my favorite would be, have a person who's like 9 months pregnant, the water is about to break, have a person who's achieved the 9th stage, is just about to achieve shamatha, put them into an MRI with simultaneous EEG, and say, okay, you can give birth now, and have them actually achieve shamatha while in the MRI. That would be very interesting. That would be like giving birth in MRI. That may be too much to ask for, but it would be very interesting. But it would be certainly very interesting, even that's a bit difficult to do, to have a person who has achieved shamatha, and then see just what is the difference in the brain. the nervous system, the physiology in many ways, with blood tests, with saliva tests, but a longitudinal study is needed. And for this, I would suggest that as scientific research would never have made the progress it has now if we didn't have laboratories that are well-funded, graduate students who are getting scholarships and fellowships, observatories for astronomy. We would never have the progress if we didn't have the laboratories and plenty of funding for young science students. If they all had to be independently wealthy, we'd have a tiny fraction of the scientists today. No laboratories, you've really got no science at all, or not much. For the contemplative scientist, the contemplative inquirer, investigator, you don't need a $10 million lab. You need a $500 hut. And you need a couple of meals a day. And so, in fact, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it's very effective to support, 100 yogis. That would be much less than supporting a $10 million lab. But supporting them in an environment that is conducive, that's quiet, where they have the mutual support, access to a teacher, and give them some financial support so they don't all have to be independently wealthy to go into a 5 or 10-year retreat. So if we have that, and then bring in the science, then we could have some very interesting data come out. And I'll mention very briefly that my dear friend Klaus Hebben and I are moving in that direction of creating on the island of Phuket a 40-room meditation center specifically designed for long-term retreats where people can learn how to practice very well in 80 days. But then, as if I'm a head of an orphanage, after people have practiced for 80 days, if they'd like to practice for another year, 5, 10 years, then I put them in homes. That is, retreat centers I know around the world where the person heading the retreat center is willing to put them up, provide them with food for a very small amount, like utilities and food, $15 a day. And then let them practice for 5 or 10 years, and with other lamas, much more experienced than myself. It's not about me, but creating the environment, and with the support, I think over 5, 10 years, we might have some very interesting results. And one room in the Phuket Center will be allocated as a scientific research lab. And we will have primarily, I think, non-Buddhists coming in. So this is not an issue of trying to validate Buddhism, bringing Buddhist scientists in to show us that we were right all along. Bring in absolutely critical scientists, and then simply put it to the test. And try to do the longitudinal study. I think there's great potential there. And we're starting with Klaus's help, enormous help.
Thank you.
So, Alan, I just want to bring it back a little bit from that remarkable vision.
Here and now.
Taking a bit of a cue from Amishi's comment about compassion and virtue. In the beginning of your talk, you spoke about a broadening of the definition of samadhi.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you to unpack the practice of the 4 measurables in the context of shamatha, because I'm hoping that this time is going to set up so nobody needs an orientation into what else you taught.
Sure. I'll try to make a really mini discourse on that, because I was the one that selected the meditations for the shamatha project, these 2 3-month retreats. I selected the 3 methods, but I felt, having meditated a little bit myself, knowing that when you're meditating 8 or 10 hours a day, a lot of emotions come up, desires come up, internal obstacles arise. And having done a little bit of practice of the cultivation of loving kindness and so forth, I found these very helpful for developing emotional regulation, for opening the heart, developing a broader sense, not just about my situation, I, me, mine, but a broader sense. And so I thought this would be very helpful as a complement to the shamatha to have, number one, help people through the difficulties that they'll encounter in shamatha practice, on the one hand, but also the cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, and so forth are valuable no matter what, with or without shamatha. They are universal virtues that I think all of us value. And so for both reasons. And so what I had found from my little experience, and I think some other meditators found also, that as they progressed in shamatha, their cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity was definitely enhanced. But as they are practicing, meditatively cultivating loving kindness, attending to first themselves, but then others in a spirit of caring, a spirit of affection, really bringing forth the yearning and aspiration, might you find happiness, the causes of happiness. A kind of happiness arises in one's own mind. As His Holiness has so often commented, when you're developing compassion, the first person to benefit is yourself. And then because it brings greater serenity, greater peace, greater sense of well-being. So I won't go into the meditations themselves, but specific meditations, and these are not simply to cultivate an emotion. I think this is very important. In the Buddhist understanding, loving kindness is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, a yearning. May you find happiness and the causes of happiness. This is loving kindness directed towards you. May you be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. It's an aspiration. That's compassion. If you find great success, or you find much happiness, or you cultivate great virtue, taking delight in your success, your virtue, this is not an aspiration, that is an emotion. It is joy in your joy, right? So that is an emotion, and then equanimity is not simply feeling neutral, but it's an impartiality, that the feeling of caring, of tsewa, of caring, of loving kindness, compassion, extends equally to all sentient beings, finally all sentient beings. And so for each of these are meditations, they complement each other, and I think many people have found that insofar as you cultivate this, the mind as a whole becomes more peaceful, more balanced, happier. And then that's very good for shamatha. But the more focused you become in shamatha, the more effective your practices of loving kindness and so forth. So I think there's a lot of balance there, and a very, very wonderful foundation. And another, as you well know, a major reason I chose those practices is whether you're Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, agnostic, materialist, you can practice these. And we did have all of those people in our retreat, and all of them got benefit, whether they believed in reincarnation, karma. I never, and you know, in our 11-page questionnaire of people applying for this retreat, we never asked them, do you have a Buddhist worldview? Are you religious? We never asked, right? And so it was open to anybody who practiced.
We subsequently asked.
After the fact, but that was not a
It
prerequisite.
wasn't a
for getting in.
requirement. It was just something
it's
to
very
know.
interesting afterwards, sure. But this was not a prerequisite, and it's quite clear that people who are Buddhist, non-Buddhist can benefit from these practices, and out of the experience, you may find greater faith, confidence, trust arising, but not simply based on authority, but your own experience. Yeah, wonderful.
Can I ask about something very different? I got a little bit lost when you were talking about awareness of awareness, I think, and when you were talking about awareness of dreams and what's going on.
Right.
And partly because I think I was thinking about this through a different Buddhist framework.
Right.
And I'm a little bit interested about how objects are analyzed within the... I'm a little bit interested in how objects of the mind are analyzed, classified according to Tibetan tradition. So according to the Theravada tradition, objects of the mind can be of a number of different types. Basically, they can be sense data, so visible object, audible object, etc. And they could be a present sense data.
Present?
Present.
Present.
It actually exists.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed.
It could be something that is past.
Yes.
It can also be something that is future, but we won't go into that. So present or past, sense data.
Yes.
It can also be the mind, chitta, chittasika.
Yes.
So mental factors can also be objects. Again, present or past or future.
Yeah.
Then there's another category, which is concept. Now, when you were dreaming, basically the object would normally be an object coming not through the senses, but through the mind door. And it may be conditioned by past sense data experience and mind door experience, but it's largely just concept, unless you are actually remembering. If you are, you could have a dream that is just a simple memory, but of course memories are also constructs. So I got a little bit lost in what you were saying about you were actually experiencing something there in a dream. Because according to my understanding, at least of the Theravada analysis, in a dream you would be experiencing a past, well, a concept. Concepts are neither past, present, they're not classifiable by that system. A concept's a concept. It's a construct, a mental construct.
Right. I think it really depends on how you're defining concept. And there may be different definitions for this. I like to take the example of a lucid dream. So you recognize the dream as a dream. And in the midst of that, I've had a little bit of experience, so I know it happens. And in the midst of but it happens in a non-lucid dream anyway, but when you're lucid, you actually know that it's happening. You know that what you're experiencing is not the external environment. When I'm looking at you now, I'm assuming there really is somebody over there. You're not just a construct, a free creation of my mind, but there's someone I'm speaking with who has an independent mind stream from mine.
According to Buddhism, I am just a concept.
Yeah, but then it's a matter of definition once again. But this person over here, if I die, you don't die. You don't vanish. You don't disappear when I close my eyes. That there's something independent of my mind stream that we will call a set of 5 skandhas, if you like. But in this regard then, when you're dreaming, there are appearances that you could directly observe. You're looking at a lake in the dream and you see the sun shining off the waves. It's an immediate content experience. You're looking at it. You're seeing it very much like seeing reflections of the waves during the daytime. You may hear somebody say, Alan, and you hear them say that. You're not just you actually heard it say that. You may get the scent of a rose, the taste of watermelon, and so forth. And so I would say this is direct perception. Of course, it's configured by knowing what watermelons are. Of course, it's configured by the brain. And of course, it's configured by past experience. If you've never seen a watermelon in your whole life, very unlikely a watermelon will appear in your dream. If you're deaf, you'll probably not hear people talking in a dream. So it's based upon past experience, but it's not simply a replication of past experience. It would be like saying that Van Gogh or any other great painter was just painting things that other people had painted. Because after all, he was using the same paints. Well, in fact, they're all unique creations, but they were using the same paints. And so in a similar fashion, when you're dreaming, it's a fresh creation. It's unprecedented, even though the seeing colors is based upon visual perception and so forth. So exactly, I mean, I would ask His Holiness Jimbala, exactly what is the category for the facsimiles of vision, of sound, and so forth that you're directly perceiving in a dream? I think I wouldn't quite call it a concept, but what would you, you're all more knowledgeable than I, what would you call that? What category would that be?
shungne da shebe yu dobe ga ya shebe yu de she jebe ga ya wangbo yu su jing chu de ba da de su mo xiang tang xia chu yo res de na xin da yi da wangbo yi gi shebe sla be na da di yu li ya ani ya kan da dok da sla or kan da de tunji yu de ni concept le yung yo was da di chen de la ne melam ge yu di 대명 돈의 쉐베는 컨셉트하고 차기 어디인자 또 무슨 그 용어도 간다 시한도 그랬어.
Could I just add the word in Pali
is prajapti.
Panyati.
Yeah, prajapti. 다요리죠. prajapti. 그래서 배제비 주 계집에 소리 선단 거래. 그래서 휴지계집에 휴지계집에 가다 주보 이시기 주보 이시기 유리야. 휴지계집이야. 다 휴지계집 공도 두유도 가나.
그래 봐. 밀럼 휴지죠.
나. 대는 다는 코나서는 다요라. The sujin the suja. So you wouldn't say it's a form. It doesn't belong to the form category.
수지지 말이죠.
Well, it could be. It could be
dream.
A visible form.
We're getting into very technical discussion.
맨날 세바지 띵인 징기. 지금 유지고도. 따디? 야 왕조 속셔거.
What about the objects that are created in the meditation? What are they called? The kasanas?
Nimitas. And then the nimitas.
Nimitta is panyati.
So it's prajapti.
For example, the counterpart sign. The counterpart sign in practice samatha.
It's prajnapti because
but
it is visible, but it's not classified as it's classified as prajnapti because it is not subject to anicca, dukkha, anatta.
But also, say for example, if you create a water in that state, that water is supposed to be performing water's function.
But I think it's still classified
as prajapti.
그래서 다요랑 샤기 그랬어. 나도 군답을 수사시로.
나를 군답을 수사해.
왕주수. 예. 그래서 세상한테 쉬지be 수가다 군답을 수 쉬지be 수나 샤마도 군답을 수 가자. 쉬지be 수 상원을 군답을 수 시행해 봐.
시행을 나를.
shmello.
So in the Indo Tibetan tradition, so
Tiado kare ngoba kudu mare. Zena le na ba rejimo de sushe shmello.
So, for example, in the Abhidhamma Samuchaya, Asanga system speaks of forms that belong to the mental objects domain. So, one of which is the dream objects, and another one is this meditatively created forms. So there's in fact a list of 5 of those different types of forms, which are all not part of the visible sensory domain, but rather mental objects. So one of which is referred to as the Prajapti form. Prajapti form, yeah.
Let me add just a bit of perspective from cognitive neuroscience, psychology about all of these matters related to evidence from brain imaging. So consistent with Alan's take on what's happening during lucid dreaming, it has been demonstrated in certain brain imaging experiments that skilled participants in imagery are able to receive instructions and create in the mind and brain images that they experience, and I'll exaggerate a little bit, but almost as if those objects that are associated with the images were actually present, and the brain activity that's supporting these kinds of subjective experiences will involve mechanisms that are both in the anterior part of the brain that are responsible for generating activity in the posterior part of the brain, and in particular activity in various levels of visual cortex. So we know starting at the rear of the brain in the occipital lobes, there are different visual areas that start off being very concrete in nature. That's primary visual cortex. This then feeds into secondary visual cortex, still in the occipital lobes, corresponding to a sequence of so-called Brodmann's areas that are localized sites within the brain. The first one, I believe, is area 17, then it goes to 18, then it goes to 19. But the point is, during these imagery experiences, activity almost all the way back to the first level of visual cortex is induced by executive processes in the front of the brain that have the goal of developing images that then will, in effect, get perceived in a quasi-direct manner of the sort to which you were alluding. So you got this kind of cycling where he generates him that flows forward, gets perceived here, and around you go, consistent with... so it's more than just abstract conceptualization that, according to this neuroscience evidence, would be involved with the subjective.
In other words, David, you were saying that what happens is very similar to the actual brain processes that happens when you see something.
Exactly. The front of the brain induces activity in the back of the brain that's very similar to the activity that would occur if stimulation was feeding into the brain through the eyeballs, interior parts of the brain, to the back here, in the presence of an actual object. And in fact, in the first Mind and Life public meeting, which was at MIT 6 years ago, one of the presenters, Stephen Koslin from Harvard University, is a principal investigator in demonstrating the occurrence of these processes through brain imaging methodology together with instructions for generating imagery experiences.
So something I find especially interesting here is that when we direct our attention outwards to stars, to terrestrial phenomena, that we can do a lot better than naked eye observation by means of telescope, microscope, this wonderful array of technology, and also auditory, that we can hear things much better than the naked ear, so to speak. But I would suggest that with mental perception, or call it introspection, we have a privileged access, not infallible, but a privileged access to our own mental states and processes, and the possibility of actually refining this mode of perception through meditation. You meditate a whole lot, your eyesight doesn't get much better, probably not any better. Your hearing may not get any better. So for the 5 physical senses, you meditate a lot, but you may still need glasses. But you meditate, so these are not refinable by means of meditation, but they happily are refinable through technology. I don't know of any technology thus far that refines your ability for introspection or mental perception. That is, in the Buddhist understanding, is enormously plastic, malleable. It's very crude at the beginning, but through extensive training, 5,000, 10,000 hours, your privileged access to mental states can be refined to a very sophisticated mode of observation and experimentation, which then can complement the marvelous technology from modern science.
The technology that is currently available is called LSD.
Yes, I've heard about that. With not total dependability on the veracity of one's observation.
Could I just qualify what I said? In the sense, of course, a lot of the objects in our waking life are also conceptual. So that,
what do you mean by that? I really don't understand.
Well, the mind, can only see color. If I look over there and see flowers, that is, when I have the idea of flower, that is a concept that is built up on a number of sense data. But as I understand it, I cannot see a flower. That is a mental construct, just as I cannot see you. So when I look at you, I see lots of colors.
I'm actually quite a Wittgensteinian in this regard, and that is to say, I can't see your jacket. Implies that I see you naked, or I can't see your body. Go down. Please.
So in kind of the Indo-Tibetan discourse in the epistemology, there's a debate on how do we understand the perceptual process when a perception occurs. Does the perceptual process require an interpretation where akara is imposed, a form is imposed upon the object or sense data, or is it more of a mirroring, one-to-one representation? So, so in the Tibetan texts that are available, on this point, the suggestion is made that the Vaibhashika's position is that of without akara. So His Holiness was asking, is the Theravada's position one without akara or with akara? Because Vaibhashika's position in general is
the question clear, Rupert? I might be able to clarify a little bit. If it's clear, I don't want to say anything. Let's take the brown color of your jacket. Just basic quality. I look over there, I get brown. Okay? Is the brown that I see, is that actually objectively in the molecules, the fiber of your jacket? Or is brown, do I see your jacket by way of a visual image that's in part constructed by something of my visual faculty? That's the question.
I thought akara is shape. Form.
Yeah, it's a form that is imposed upon the sense data.
Because I think the position of the Theravada is that you can only see color, you cannot see shape. Well, shape is not the object of the eye, because the argument is that you can also sense shape through touch. So shape is not an object of visible perception. Only color is the object of visible perception.
네, 남자비 주시는 거도.
본버스 랍두고라 아니 않고
네, 보고라고 도마도 계시는 거다. 네.
If I'm not mistaken,
남의 라보죠. 근데 지라마.
그런데 선생님한테 치료 가이드 전에 라보 통보래 참 유진 통보래 유진 통말이스. 라보 자스 뭐 주르시. 셰디 거르다.
단데 남의
안 되는 남자는 계시다. 안 되디 시링이 계시고 다른 게 있어야 돼.
볼하게 돼. 남의 몇 줍제 가르스나 변에 지라마하게 가르사 지dembe 지게리아 아니 지통부터는 도통순스 라교레스 사통아 가르사 마동은 되는 사통요 말이죠. 단디다 보시기로 그러. 데 베네메도 미통 말이스. 메도 카도도 미통 그랬어. 메도스 랍두고라니 그 도배간 레자레스.
템플릿 내내 있는 건지 제기요.
네.
I'm not sure.
So according to this position, the flower is not a visible form. It's the color of the flower that is the visible.
The flower is something you can strip back. The flower, when you have the idea, I am looking at a rose, this is, you have built this up through visible perception. The eye doesn't see a rose, the mind sees.
So it's at the mind door level. It's at the level of manas.
At the level of mind door, you can. The eye sees color.
So, I mean, so for example, one of the distinctions made between so sensory experience and conceptual thought is that the sensory tends to relate to the object in a very present moment. So whatever's there, it's directly perceived. So wouldn't one have to accept that whatever's there, which are the properties of the flower, shape, color, and smell, wouldn't all of these be objects of the senses?
Not according to each of the things that.
Can you translate that?
So, I mean, wouldn't one have to say that although this is a flower, it's at the level of manas, mental cognition.
So it's come.
But the senses will have to be perceiving the flower. Which is the base, because when you say this is a flower, then you're already giving a label.
Yes.
But the perception of the flower. So the sensory experience that give rise to the thought, this is a flower, that sensory experience, wouldn't that have perceived the flower?
As I understand the analysis, not the flower directly, only the color, smell, whatever.
So in a sense, it's sort of, in the debating mode. So this seems to lead to a position where you see the properties, but not the bearer of the property.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
And it's a semantic difference in that.
But then even wouldn't you say the color itself is a kind of a property? Also, it can be a property bearer as well, if you attribute properties onto the color.
As a soft.
So like say, if you say it has got a round shape, so then the roundness becomes the property of that shape, and then the shape becomes the property bearer.
Yes, I mean I feel the burden of trying to represent the Theravada position. My understanding. My understanding may be wrong of what the Theravada Abhidhamma is saying, but I think what it is saying is that the senses, the object of the actual that you get through the senses is very simple.
Very simple.
Smell, color,
Yeah.
taste, whatever. And then you build on that very quickly, and there are lots of different levels.
Yeah.
So first of all, you recognize red, then you put more together, and you put it together, and you get the shape, and then eventually you get the idea this is a rose or a particular kind of flower.
Yeah, but the red is already in interpretation because it's going to depend a lot on what the illumination is, and you'll see the red constant despite large changes in illumination, so the wavelength coming into your eye is going to be different. I think what we're debating really is the meaning of the word see, and it's clear that it's a complex process, as you yourself said, and goes through a lot of stages, transformations, and so on, before we get to the final experience.
The point of departure here was simply that when you're in the midst of a dream, lucid or not, you are picking up colors and sounds, and you are also interpreting, configuring, conditioning them by your past experience. So if I dream of Rupert, I say, oh yes, there's Rupert, Pali scholar.
It is past memory.
That's for sure. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, on the whole, yeah, you will not dream of the content. That is your how do you say, your box of colors is going to be from your past experience, and then you'll come up with free creations, but only from the box of colors you have. And so I can't dream what it's like to be a bat.
So,
What about some dreams which seem to be very indicative and very, kind of quite accurate about future?
There we have to. There we have to.
His Holiness was saying that he knew people, he knows people who wouldn't lie, and they have, given him reports of these accounts.
And even I.
Oh, yes.
Even I have heard of many accounts like this.
Yes.
I think this one may be one area where it may be a metaphysical question for one group and not a metaphysical question for another group. It's a possibility. Then a metaphysical matter. And so then, if this happens, so I just want to be open and try to be as objective as possible. If that does happen, that it wasn't just chance, just by accident, but one actually does have some precognition, or something far away in space. So it's called remote viewing. If that takes place, so let's assume we don't know for sure.
Yes.
Some people maybe do know for sure, but I don't know for sure. But if it takes place, then I think we need to have a broader concept of the mind that makes that intelligible, makes it that we can make sense. And so then in the Buddhist understanding, we have not only the coarse mind, but a subtle mind. So it can happen in principle that a person may be born blind, not Buddhist framework. A person may be born blind, but if that person achieves shamatha, has past life recollection, that person may dream in color in this life by drawing on memories from past life, right? Or, so there's one dimension, right? So again, we're just for the time being saying within Buddhist framework. We're not saying, oh, please believe me, this is true. But if this does happen, we have to make it intelligible. And so we may be tapping into a deeper dimension of subtle consciousness, or there's the very deep, the extremely subtle consciousness, which may have access to events in the future. And of course, in Buddhist view, the Buddha Shakyamuni had a lot of access to things in the future. Not understandable by coarse mind, not by subtle mind, but a much deeper dimension. So I think scientifically, the first thing would be determine, does it happen? If it does happen, you have to stretch your notion of the mind and not insist the mind is just a product of the brain. If it's not clear that it happens, then you don't have to explain.
So
And then there is also discussion about a special body that you assume in dream.
Special dream body.
Dream body.
Yeah. Special dream body. Now we're definitely in esoteric area.
Yeah.
And so now we're talking about out-of-body experiences, where it's not just imagined, but you have an out-of-body experience, and you're able to ascertain things that other people can ascertain, who are not dreaming. If that happens.
So this is not just...
전주 맞직지셔가지고 전주지
Yeah.
뒤직지셔는 저 고스라야는 여바를 냠바라야는 여바를 가게 버리.
So this is a phenomenon not just because of confined to high levels of yogi, but there was a story of one of the Tibetan officials in Tibet. Once his mother went into this very deep sleep for about a week actually, and when she woke up, she told a very vivid account of the various places that she has visited to her son. And it's the son who told the story to His Holiness. So His Holiness was saying that he knew the person quite well. There was no reason why he should have made it up.
Here,
So during the sleep, the breathing process, the respiration is still going on. So it's not someone who has stopped breathing.
Here I think the cultural relativity is once again very important. There's a maximum I've heard many times from my scientific friends and colleagues, that the more extraordinary the claim, like somebody had direct access to something in the future, or distant in space, or had an out-of-body experience, these are extraordinary claims. The more extraordinary the claim, the more robust, or solid, or reliable must be the evidence. But often this is said as if there's only one perspective, and that is only the scientific perspective. But I would say there are multiple perspectives, and that is for a yogi living in Tibet in the 19th century, there was nothing extraordinary about people making claims of clairvoyance or having about it. It was completely normal. It was very common. That I've never seen a Buddhist text that gave a bunch of logical arguments to affirm that clairvoyance occurs. And so it was not extraordinary in that context. Now maybe they were, from a scientific perspective, maybe the whole culture was diluted. But maybe not. And so from the Tibetan perspective, let's say 19th century, the notion that human beings got into a metal box and traveled to the moon and walked and jumped around and came back would be a very extraordinary claim. And they would say, could that have been faked? Is the United States so honest they would never try to deceive anybody? It's an extraordinary claim. Now, from my perspective, of course it happened. But I think there are Tibetans nowadays who still think, maybe, maybe not. Because from our perspective, that's very extraordinary. So it's simply to acknowledge there are multiple cultures and multiple disciplines of knowledge, and what is extraordinary for one is not necessarily extraordinary for another.
I would like to pass the word to Sean, who, from the philosophical side, could maybe wrap this all up.
Oh. I didn't intend to do that. I wanted to go back to the flower and the perception of the flower. I thought there was some consensus growing between Rupert's description and the cognitive psychologists. They seem to be agreeing. But from the phenomenological point of view, it seems confused, because there might be a confusion between what's going on in the brain, and certainly there's a lot of processes and building up, so to speak, of things in the brain. But I think the phenomenologist would say, I actually perceive the flower. My experience is of the flower. It's not of all these processes. So there's at least two levels of description here. One level of description is these neuronal processes going on in the brain and accomplishing this kind of perceptual process, but the perception itself is of the flower. Yeah. And so we all go around saying, oh, I see the flower, and we mean it. So I'm wondering, does that make sense out of what I see as a kind of consensus growing about that?
I would say from the Madhyamaka perspective, which you've not addressed now, Madhyamaka has no problem saying, where's Rupert? Oh, I see him, he's over there. That's perfectly valid. Now, how do I know Rupert's over there? I see him by way of his visual form. I don't see his mind, but I see the visual form, and seeing his visual form is enough to say, oh, I see Rupert. It's not saying that I see some indestructible ego substance that is invisible and abiding someplace in the metaphysical realm. It's just that's what it means to see Rupert. And likewise, so everything you said is completely consonant with Madhyamaka, that like Wittgenstein is making use of ordinary language. We see flowers, we see people. And now, having said that, let's not be simplistic, that I'm seeing a Rupert independent of his body and his mind, the real Rupert who has a body and mind. That's ridiculous. But this is meaningful, accurate speech to say, I know that Rupert's here because I saw him. A person say, Alan, you don't know whether he's here or not. You didn't see him. You only saw his body. this is not useful speech. And so I think the phenomenology and the Madhyamaka are very close here, that we take ordinary speech very seriously. And then we try to make sense of it without reifying the objects of our perception.
Thank you.
Say Theravada Abhidhamma would have no argument with what Sean just said.
Interesting.
Thank you. Well, we have reached 3 o'clock, Your Holiness.
Thank you. And that is the foundation for, I would really say, all spiritual practice. But with total confidence, I would say it is the foundation of all Buddhist practice. Without this, you really don't have Buddhist practice. Mm-hmm. On that basis, then we have the second tier or broad training within the Buddhist path, and that is samadhi. Now, this has become an English term now, and samadhi generally is understood as some very focused attention or maybe some higher meditative state. Its narrow term is single-pointed attention, very focused attention. But when we're speaking of the training of samadhi, not simply the practice or the mental faculty of samadhi, but the training of samadhi, then it's including much more than simply developing attention skills. It would include, for example, the cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. It entails many practices designed to really bring forth a very wholesome quality of mind and to achieve exceptional states of mental balance. So not just attention skills. So that's the broader framework. I would say, in short, that the practice of samadhi is designed to bring about an exceptional state of mental health, well-being, and balance. And that is considered to be a foundation.
Balance.
And so, since the principal instrument of inquiry in the Buddhist tradition is not externalized, it's not a telescope, it's not an fMRI, your principal instrument of inquiry is your own mind. If your mind is dysfunctional, or dysfunctional because it's just flip-flopping between dullness and excitation, and then you try to engage in some rigorous inquiry with a mind that is getting dull and distracted, then the inquiry is not going to be very rigorous. And so in Buddhist inquiry, the primary instrument to be refined, as kind of one could say contemplative technology, is your own mind. And that really is the task or the purpose of training in samadhi. The culmination of the Buddhist path is the realization or the experience of wisdom, insight, and unlike many religious traditions, in Buddhism, the root of suffering, the fundamental root of suffering, why do we suffer, is identified as ignorance and delusion, and not that we've been disobedient to God, that we don't have enough faith, that we've not submitted sufficiently, and so forth. So it's not theistically based of trying to please somebody else, but in fact we suffer because we're ignorant, and therefore if you want to be free of suffering, you must supplant or replace ignorance with knowledge, insight. And it's not just coming up with the right answers, believing, having all something very significant to the scientific tradition, and in turn benefit from the scientific tradition. In terms of the overall framework, or subject, for my presentation, I want to first paint a very large picture of the framework of Buddhist practice, which is familiar to all Buddhists here. The actual nature of shamatha, shamatha being a Sanskrit term, which is really referring to an array of methods for refining attention skills. Right? The challenges for introspection, that is, if we are going to include introspection as a means of inquiry, seeking to understand the nature of the mind, the potentials of the mind, very deep issues about the nature of consciousness itself, are there challenges built in, or is this going to be very easy to integrate into science? The fact that introspection is not used extensively or rigorously in modern mind sciences indicates there may be some problems here, in which they must be addressed. On the other hand,
introspection is
and then the indispensability of introspection, the metamirunga. We must, that is, for a full understanding, if such is possible, or even to approach a full understanding of the mind, one must, I believe, include first-person perspective. It is indispensable. You can't skip it and just study the brain and study behavior and never rely on anybody's first-person account of their own experience. Then the question is, can the introspective observations be more rigorous? Can the reports be more sophisticated? And this is where Buddhism, I think, has much to contribute. Final point that David has already made, so I will make it very briefly, but the complementarity of Buddhist and scientific methods of inquiry. The great strengths of science tend to be not the strengths of Buddhism. The strengths of Buddhism, likewise, overall, not the strengths of modern science. And then I'll end with quite a number of open questions, some of which may be interesting for our following discussion. So this framework of Buddhist practice is true, I believe, pretty much of all schools of Buddhism, that the foundation is really ethics. It is leading a wholesome way of life. It is seeking to do our best to avoid injury. So now I'll address the general audience. By means of our activity of body, speech, and mind, do our utmost to follow the principles of ahimsa, of not deliberately injuring, on the one hand, so that's the negative side, try to avoid that. On the other hand, when possible, when the opportunity arises, seek to be of service. Try to help, as David so well said, alleviate suffering, bring greater happiness. And this is often likened to the earth. All the right beliefs, because you can have all the right beliefs and still suffer enormously. So belief is not the same as knowledge. So this is the largest gestalt or overall form of Buddhist practice, and everything I'll have to say will fit into this. But there, you can see the arrows. Wisdom is not the foundation for ethics. It is ethics, samadhi, and wisdom. Having said that, though, it's not a one-way influence. And that is, as you develop your abilities in samadhi, this enhances, supports ethics. As you develop greater wisdom, this supports and enhances samadhi, and so there's a synergy, among the three. But overall, this is the hierarchy.
No.
So now going to a very specific practice, I teach this a lot, I emphasize this a lot, but it must be stated that within the large framework of Buddhist meditative practices, which literally does include hundreds of different meditative practices, shamatha, I would say, is not the most important. It's one of many, but if one is missing the qualities of attention that you cultivate through shamatha, then none of the other practices will go very well. That is, if your mind is still very prone to laxity, jingwa, or excitation, gopa, none of the other practices, even the highest practices, dzogchen or vajrayana, the practice will be very high, the practitioner is quite low, in which case you don't get the fruit. And so there are two faculties or mental processes, and Rupert will have a lot to say about these later on, or at least as much as he wants to say, within the list of 48, 51, 52. But two mental faculties are utterly indispensable, for the practice of shamatha, and one of these is mindfulness. Now, here is a definition of mindfulness that is textually based, very long history, I think non-controversial, but it's not the same as the definition of mindfulness that one finds today in modern psychology. It's not to refute one, it's to say this is a broader umbrella, a larger term than the very specific definition that is used in John Kabat-Zinn's marvelous work in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and overall very, very commonly now in more and more studies. So here's one definition that is really quite common in broad strokes to the Theravada, to the Mahayana. This is not controversial and it's not sectarian. So mindfulness is a faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. Now the term in Pali, Sanskrit, and Tibetan, sati, smriti, tamba, has a large connotation or meaning of recollection, So mindfulness can be understood in three ways. And that is, I recollect what I had for breakfast this morning. We can call this retrospective mindfulness, looking back. I'm practicing mindfulness of breathing. I'm not remembering breaths I had yesterday. It's an ongoing flow of recollection, trying to overcome the dispersion, toa, of the mind. And so it's present-centered mindfulness, but it's very specifically focused on the sensations of the breath. So we have retrospective, we have present-centered, which is very central to shamatha, and then we also have prospective memory, maombalatapa. So for example, as you're in dream yoga, as you're falling asleep, you may create a very strong resolve, or pemba. Tonight when I'm dreaming, I will recognize that I'm dreaming. I will recognize the dream state as the dream state. You're sending your mindfulness into the future to remember to do something in the future when you're dreaming. So there's retrospective, present-centered, and prospective. The moment-to-moment awareness in the present moment is definitely a form of mindfulness, but it's one of those three. And it may be very focused on the sensations of the breath. It may be very open. as in open presence. There is mindfulness there, but it's not selective. So mindfulness is not at all in contradiction to or incompatible with samadhi. In fact, I believe it's impossible to develop samadhi without developing mindfulness. So there's one mental factor. There's, in this context, I'm calling this meta-attention.
Mindfulness ko message ne je ta de so jan jan ya mi de ba chi ki ko ji len ko ba ta de chi de ko la mo ba ne she be tembe tön tak ta chang yo ma de mo ba ne she be tembe tön de be tön tembe tembe se ya da ma ba de pemba de je ten ko so
Drepung Monastery.
How would you explain the perspective?
Yeah, because we dreamed before. We've dreamed before. We know what it's like to dream, and so if you've never dreamed before, you couldn't imagine, when I'm dreaming, then I'll remember to do this. Now listen, the other mental faculty, there are only two, it's not a long list, is
Prospective.
prospective.
Can you direct?
Welcome, Your Holiness. I hope everybody else's attention is not too much distracted by having eaten, but I'm sure that Alan's presentation will be very lively and engaging so that everybody sort of overcomes that impediment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Of course, it is a great honor, also a great pleasure to be here, to try to share some knowledge that may be relevant both to Buddhism and to the rest of the modern world. I want to give a bit of preface, though, because I'm in a very anomalous situation, and that is I'm going to be talking about Buddhist meditation to a group, including audience of geshes, of lamas who have enormous background, insight, experience, and they definitely don't need any basic primer on Buddhist meditation from me, let alone His Holiness. And so the scientists have been asked to always address His Holiness as the primary audience, really the central audience. I'm going to be doing something a bit different. That is, at times I'm going to be directing more out to the scientific community, the general community, when I'm talking about basic Buddhist concepts and definitions, which His Holiness does not need to hear from me. At other times, especially when I'm suggesting interpretations or possible hypotheses of how to understand different states of meditation and so forth, then I'll turn to His Holiness, and especially to all the Buddhists here, ready to be refuted if I make some interpretation that really is quite incorrect. And also I will do this, and that is a lot of what I'll be sharing will be, of course, and everything will be in English, but a fair amount will be translated in my mind directly from Tibetan into English. So occasionally I'm going to just give a phrase, as I did in Saranat. I'll just give a phrase here and there so that there's no question about what I'm translating from the Tibetan. So I'll say something like meta-attention, da shijin. And so then hopefully the translation back into Tibetan will be very smooth, and nobody will be wondering what was he meaning then when he said that in terms of Tibetan. Okay, so that'll be the anomaly here. So,
maybe Your Holiness, would you mind to put on the microphone, because then also everybody can hear.
I have nothing to say.
No, just in case questions.
Maybe later.
Questions or additions.
Only uncomfortable.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, in terms of the title of my presentation here, one could say this is really quite an extraordinary claim for a title, as if in 12 slides, that's all I have. I'm going to be summarizing Buddhist contribution to first-person cognitive science, and of course that is not the case. It's a very vast topic, and I'm going to be focusing on a fairly narrow range, focusing especially on the practice of shamatha, but one area where I think Buddhist tradition may contribute